Welcome, everyone. I'll say welcome again. The recording announcement has gone through. And welcome to everybody to the 5th session of Children and COVID-19 Impacts, Interventions, and Supports. And I know there are a couple of people who may be joining late, and we have a few weather challenges. So fingers crossed that the technology, which we were talking before we started, sometimes there's snow, you know, there are a few glitches, and we shall see. Let me, as usual, do a little preview of the plan for today. I'm going to, again, for the benefit not only of those of you on the live Zoom, but those in the early childhood childcare community who are going to be looking at the recordings, what happened last week and how that's going to connect with this week. Then, because we both had technical difficulties and some time constraints last week, I want to show you a couple of those UNICEF children's video diaries, which are not directly related, but not directly related to this week, but related to some of the broader themes of this course. And then we're going to look at school-age children and effects of the pandemic on children's learning. There's a doggy somewhere. And then a specific focus on English language learners. Some people a couple of weeks ago, Carlotta, I think, and others really wanted to look more at those issues, and then kind of a dive into what seems to be the plan in the broad sense going forward for schools in the year to come, and then a little bit about next week. So last week, again, for the benefit of people who didn't participate or have something else going on in their lives, unlike me, recordings are available. And last week, we were looking at the age group of children from about 5 to 12 with a focus on emotional development, social development, mental health, and many of the kinds of supports that may not be available to due to the pandemic, but also some of the complexities of what are some potential supports or security that's available to some children by not being in school. So we had some interesting discussion about that and ended up with the tough realities of child maltreatment as kind of a reflection of the stresses of the pandemic and the way that that has both exacerbated the likelihood of child maltreatment, but also has unfortunately withdrawn from many families the kinds of supports that are valuable to families in buffering some of the stresses that create risk factors for maltreatment. So again, before we move into the specifics of this week's focus on children's learning, I want to make an effort now, with better luck on technology, I hope, to show you a couple of video diaries from children in 2 countries. Let me see. I'm going to stop this share. And then I'm going to share again. I think this, forgive me for talking, but yes! I get so excited if this works. Now. Oh, can you hear or no?
No, did you click the audio?
Oh, I know, I forgot. Okay.
hard because I'm just learning how to read.
Can you hear now?
I do my capoeira classes by Zoom, and my teacher tells me what to do on the computer. So we've been doing lots of treasure hunts with my little sister. I've been helping my dad draw all the maps. We start in the pirate ship, we go into the jungle, past the man-eating panther, we go into the desert of doom, we climb up the cliff, we go into this cave. Land ahoy! And always the treasure is something that me and my little sister really like pretty stones and stuff. My dad also puts 2 sweeties for each of us. My mama and my papa also read a lot of books for us. A lot of books. I don't like lockdown because I don't get to see my friends, I don't get to go to school, I don't get to go anywhere that I love. But lockdown is important because coronavirus is spreading around the world and also in this country. But when coronavirus is over, we'll be free again.
Now, what I'm going to do is show you the second children's video diary that I've selected from, I think on your resources, I have the link to all of them, and they're really, really worth looking at. The second one is a boy in DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I'd ask you to think about maybe both similarities and differences in the children's experiences and perhaps sources of resilience for both. All right, I'm going to try to share again. Well, where, okay, see if I can go back. That's not the one I want. Oh, maybe I can scroll down. Yeah. All right, bear with me for a minute. This is the one I want. Can you hear?
Allô? Comment vont le jour? Pour moi, tout évolue très bien. Qu'est-ce que tu penses par rapport à l'école? On ira quand? Tu as déjà des informations? Et moi non plus. Ok, on se reverra les jours de retour. Ok, bye. Je m'appelle Corneille Mboni. J'ai 12 ans et j'habite à Goma. J'habite ici avec ma mère, mon père, mes 4 sœurs et un frère. Et à cause de Corona, je ne vais pas à l'école. Je fais des plantations, je fais un travail, par exemple la peinture, et ma journée se passe comme ça. Nous n'avons pas de l'internet à la maison. Maintenant, je fais mes études en regardant dans mes cahiers, en faisant des révisions. Et je lis les romans de l'école. À cause de cette pandémie, je me sens très mal à l'aise car on nous prive d'aller à l'école On prive d'aller à l'église et on prive de faire quelques activités importantes. Parfois, pendant cette situation, je me sens comme un prisonnier. Ma famille a un stand de légumes, des épices. On vend aussi des épices, des tomates, des poivrons. Parfois, moi, je me mets dehors pour les aider à vendre ces épices, ces légumes-là. Ça, c'est mon chat, Nounou. Je suis très heureux de l'avoir. Je vais passer avec lui un moment parce que je ne vais plus à l'école. Je ne sais pas quand l'école va commencer, mais je continue à être intelligent et je recommande aux gens de se laver les mains et se tenir en distance quand ils parlent.
Huh. What are your thoughts? Mute.
I guess, first of all, with Cornell, there's no internet. So he has to be pretty industrious on his own, which it sounds like he really is. Quite a kid.
Yeah.
Painting, he's playing with his cat, he's planting, obviously spending more time outside, working around the home.
Also, you know, it's interesting as you're saying that. In some ways, I'm beginning to see some parallels, although there's of course nowhere near the organization by family members organizing, you know, playing pirates and so on, but kids developing their own activities and so on. There's a lot of strength in both of those children, really, but in different ways. Anyway, please, other thoughts about either of those or their connections?
Thank you for sharing those with us. They're both so beautiful.
Aren't they?
They really are. Just really, as you're saying, really is a testament to the strength of children. But I also hope that seeing those can help us. Sorry, that's my dog. But help us adults realize that we are all connected. And you know, hopefully we can look at this as how we're helping everyone across the globe.
Carlotta, please.
I think what would be really interesting would it be to have seen what these two children's lives were like before the virus.
Oh, say some more about that.
Well, because my first thought was for the first child, his family had done a lot to keep his routines similar to what they were before. And my immediate thought was maybe with Cornell, that was not the case. But then in second thought, I thought, well, maybe this is not that different from if his parents are at the fruit stand all the time, then maybe he has a lot of time where he needs to be on his own and figure out how he's going to occupy himself on his own. The big difference for him would be what he has access to at school. And in the first case, the parents could substitute for a lot of that, but in Cornell's case, probably not.
Yeah, one thing that you said triggered another thought in my mind about Cornell, and that is that because of the circumstances that he and his family live in, and these are environments in my consulting work with the World Bank and UNICEF I've seen a fair amount of, but he routinely provides really substantive help to his family. I mean, there is now many children in those circumstances are expected to provide help that is overwhelming. You know, they're walking 3 hours each way to get water for their family, for example, but not in this case, he has a role in the family's vegetable stand. He's painting. My thought is, it's not make work. I'm thinking back to some of the recommendations for American parents, mostly more well-to-do, about how to give children strength and resilience in the pandemic. And there's a lot of recommendations about finding meaningful things for children to do.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important, but this also makes me think this Cornell situation is one in which there's no need for the parents to cook up interesting projects, right? Or, well, maybe you could help peel the vegetables. Well, if you don't help peel the vegetables, then we're not going to have anything to eat. And if you don't go and do planting, this isn't let's do an interesting project, right? Where we all plant a terrarium together. Very, very interesting. Yeah.
That's that whole thing really showed cultural differences, because our kids in the US, for the most part, are everything is programmed, and everything is programmed for them by the parents. And you hear even lately the helicopter parents and finding activities for the kids to do. And it's the parents reading the books to the kids. This little guy, Cornell, went through this whole litany and said, I got books and I'm reading novels, and just the independence. And as you said he finds his own activities.
Mm-hmm. And they're meaningful, they're authentic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As we would say in education, right? Mm-hmm. They're authentic activities. Very, very interesting. I also saw common elements in that, both of the kids really are missing their friends. This is when you think about school-age children and their development. As I mentioned, I taught when I was first at the University of Delaware. We had a required course for early childhood child development students called Development in Middle Childhood. And somehow that got shunted off as, I think, the literacy courses that the state required multiplied and so on. Anyway, somehow I got assigned to teach that for years. And I absolutely loved it, because it's a period of development that is not always sort of focused on as it should be as an important period of development in its own right. And one of the key things is, as we talked about last week, is the development of relationships with peers and the nurturance and the stimulation and the validation and the identity and on and on and on that children at this time in their life are getting by having these peer relationships. And both of these kids are just really, really missing that and just looking forward. It seems like both of them seem to be able in their own way, is my perception, to make something of the time that they have now. And at the same time are just so looking forward, but with optimism. They both seem to have that inherent optimism. I'm sure these weren't randomly selected kids, that UNICEF decided to do video diaries with. But that resilience and optimism, I think, really come through, albeit in different circumstances. Other comments? Let's move on then and turn.
Sorry, Marilou, I think Carlotta had another comment.
Oh, please, Carlotta.
I was just curious, do you know what the context of UNICEF had for making these diaries? What was the context of putting them together?
I wasn't involved in this at all, and the people that I've worked with at UNICEF have not been either. I will, if we have time next week, I'm going to pull out a couple of other examples to show you guys, because I think they're really great. I think they really wanted, I'll go back to the sort of umbrella introduction to this whole thing that I have online. But my understanding was that they really wanted to show, some of it's always about fundraising, but they wanted to show people internationally in other countries, both more and less advantaged countries, what the lived experiences are for children in this pandemic. These are, I'm not sure about South Africa and that child, because there's also one from the US, but most of them are children in UNICEF countries. There's one I really want to show you. This doesn't answer your question, but there's a little girl, she's older than she looks by her teeny size. She's in a refugee camp in Yemen. And my goodness, you think that Cornell has a challenging reality in his life. Just wait till you see this. But this kid is like bopping around the camp and washing her hands at the little drippy spout and so on. I think it really is raising awareness and really helping people think about the strengths the children have, but also what they need. You know, he is getting books from his school, and it may very well be that in Congo that the school, you know, has supports from UNICEF, right? He has a phone, but hardly any children don't, you know, so he's staying connected. Anyway, so I'll see what else I can think of. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll see what I can find out. All righty. Let me go back to our from current slide. No. There we go. Okay. So shifting back to the United States and the major issues to consider this week, really the focus is on how the pandemic has affected and may continue affecting children's learning, particularly in these years from 5 to 12. But again, for especially those of you who are focusing more on younger children in childcare, early childhood settings, much of this is directly relevant as well. The first key point is that there is consensus about the reality of the pandemic having for many children losing learning opportunities as schools closed and as there was a pivot to, at first, nothing in many cases, and then to virtual classrooms, remote learning, and so on. And the data about what often is called learning loss, although there are also people, and I guess I would be one of them, who kind of push back against that, because to me, it sounds deterministic, you know, like one thing, if something's lost, it can't be found again. I've seen the phrase unfinished learning. I think that's, to me, I think words matter, and it's not just a euphemism. It's a different way of thinking about it. That in some cases the learning that children were engaged in is not finished or is continuing at a different pace, perhaps, or in a different context than it was before. There are a few little pieces of data. There was a big study quite recently by the RAND Corporation and the Gates Foundation, and they were estimating, these weren't direct assessments of kids, but they were estimating from sort of comparable data on average, and again, this is across ages, that children associated with the pandemic were about a half a year behind in reading and a full year behind in math. That was, I mean, that's a pretty sobering possibility. There's another study, and I think you have links to all of these, that was reported by National Public Radio, but there's a link to the full study that kind of gives a less negative picture, and it does use actual assessments of children's skills through a good assessment. And that doesn't show such dire results when you compare the results during the pandemic with comparable results before. But here's the thing, they acknowledge that I think as many as a quarter of the kids who should have taken the assessment during the pandemic period last fall didn't take the assessment, and that they were disproportionately children who were from low-income families or Black or brown children, the very children that you would expect to be most affected by the loss of high quality in-person learning opportunities that were kind of pulled out from under them because of the pandemic. So I'm just saying that to say learning loss, unfinished learning is a reality. The news may be better or worse depending on the sources of data, but there's other evidence that this year, 40% of first graders by some assessments needed intensive intervention in reading. And, reading, as we know, is like a critical issue in first grade. And that was significantly up from a year ago, the percentage of kids who were deemed in need of intensive intervention. And the concern is that in the early grades, that if the foundations for reading are not as robust as one would like them to be, that those gaps may only widen. It's the rationale for public pre-K, for example, that in the absence of quality early learning opportunities, the gaps that children enter school with in these critical areas are likely to widen. Teachers also are reporting for children across this age group real decreases in children's engagement in learning. They also point out that the children, and this goes to not equal for everybody, that children who were kind of top students in these grades before are more likely to continue. I'm thinking about the little boy in South Africa. I would bet that would be a description of him. Whereas children who were struggling learners before, even under relatively good circumstances, are struggling even more. So learning loss. One other thing that I just wanted to mention was a study that was reported, I think, in Education Week, and it was looking at the time that children have spent in learning experiences before and then during the pandemic. Instructional time is what the study was calling it. That included both time being taught by a teacher and time spent in independent learning activities. And again, across the board, kids, now, that doesn't say whether the time is quality time or not, but we do know that just the time, the opportunity to learn through either independent learning or teacher-guided learning is significantly less. So, I think a bottom line issue is that there are serious concerns about impact on children's learning. And for children who already are vulnerable, and in a minute, I want to really focus on English language learners as an example. We've looked a bit at children with disabilities, but children who are already vulnerable by virtue of poverty, by virtue of disability status, by virtue of language issues, on and on and on, more serious. And as we say in every area of development, and whether it's physical health or mental health, it's not that this has just created disparities, but it's shown and heightened the disparities that already existed. It's sort of shining a spotlight on those disparities. And you know, I'm sort of depressed even just saying that, but I think, you know, later on in this class, we'll see some examples of promising directions that things are taking. But let me just ask before we go on to look at English language learners, if any of you have either comments, examples, insights about the reality of this unfinished learning and who it's impacting. Just either wave your hand or speak up if you do. I'll wait a bit. And alrighty, how about if we look at English language learners? Okay. Let me actually then ask you to put your thinking and talking caps on this issue. And I know we had a little bit of discussion of this maybe several weeks ago. I think Carlotta was one person who was really concerned about this. We know that the pandemic has created difficulties for English language learners. In your thinking, what kinds of impacts do you think it may be having and why for this particular group?
Well, for one thing, if kids are spending more time at home with their nuclear family, and there isn't anyone in their nuclear family that speaks English, they're losing out just on the amount of time they're exposed to the English language.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying exposed. I think, Laura, you were going to add something to that. Thank you. Yeah.
No, that's very, yes. And then the other thing I was wondering about was if they're, if they're also getting Zoom learning. I mean, again, I don't know how each school district is doing that, but I mean, parents that speak English and know some technology have found some difficulties accessing their students' grade level pieces. I don't know if it's offered in other languages or every language. So a family that's speaking another language to try to navigate the English directions on the technology might be, again, another difficulty.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. My sense is, and this is not my specialization at all, but I've been reading my little eyeballs out about all of this stuff, trying to put together what I can for you all. And some large school districts and in Los Angeles, Unified School District in California is one, have been putting together bilingual, especially Spanish language, versions of various things, but honestly, it's the exception rather than the rule. And I think another issue, and then I want to show you a little, fingers crossed, a little video. Another issue that maybe is indirectly suggested by what you were saying, Karen, is that the interaction with English language speaking peers is gone. It's not just, being in school with a teacher directly teaching them and maybe a bilingual teacher and so on, but it's the bath of English, like when you travel and you're living in a country and you're hearing, it's not just the instruction that you're receiving, but the kids in the lunchroom or the kids out at recess, and the level of motivation to learn if you want to play a ball game with kids who speak a different language than you do, and so on. So, this I want to mention before we move on from this photograph. This I copied from a New York Times piece that was fairly recent, and it featured this 6th grader, I think, from Bangladesh. And before the pandemic, it was a fairly recent immigrant with her mom. I've spent quite a bit of time in Bangladesh, so I was kind of drawn to the picture in the story. She was really learning a lot of English before the pandemic and before her school closed. Now, a quote from her is, she said, "I feel like this year is going to waste," as far as her progress in English. The only technology, as the photograph shows, that she has available is an iPhone for her distance lessons. And one of the things that she says is that she's lost her confidence in speaking, because it's just really hard for her to get up her nerve. You know, in the classroom, somehow for her, it was just more comfortable. Her teacher was right there, her friends there, and speaking, I mean, it's sort of like speaking on Zoom or something, you know, really hard for her. And she felt like she had really begun to learn the grammar, which was really difficult. And now she's lost a lot of the grammar as well. So, you know, that's sort of a little portrait of what it can be like. I'm going to try to show you now, before we look at some other approaches. Wait a minute, before I go on, Claudia, I'm sorry, Claudia, please.
Yeah, I had a couple of things. One, we have a family with whom we've been friendly for about 25 years. When they first came here from Russia, they had almost no English. Their son, who was 12, had quite a bit more, but they both entered the workforce and were quite fluent within a few years and spoke English. And when we saw them, they were very comfortable talking with us. Well, now they've both retired for over a year, and they're at home and they're speaking Russian, and they are losing their fluency in talking with us. We can still communicate, but not nearly as comfortably. And they're adults. So imagine a child who's just picking up a new language, the impact of not being surrounded by that. And the other issue I think about is the disparities in the emphasis and comfort level with using language. We saw a study that showed that children in upper middle class homes had several million more words that they were hearing within a certain length of time compared to very poor children. And certainly there are poor children who have very rich language environments, but many of them unfortunately don't. And so the home language environment is another big limitation, no matter what the language. This little girl that you pointed out from Bangladesh seems to have a rich, you get the feeling she has a rich language environment of her own. So at least her language is being developed, it's just not the English language.
Yes, and we do know that, especially with children younger than she is, that a sound foundation in the home language, right, really predicts more successful acquisition of and use of a second language. Yeah. Great, thank you. Let me see if I can get that video. Let's see. Oh. All right, there's more than one way to skin this cat. I do not know why this happens. Can you see the screen that I just shared?
Yes. Could you imagine being that one?
With so many schools across the country beginning the academic year with remote learning, Educators are increasingly worried some students could slip through the cracks and fall further behind, particularly those learning English as a second language. ABC's Era Reshef takes a look at the challenges they may face this fall.
The COVID-19 crisis forcing schools nationwide to grapple with how or if they can open safely. This photo of mostly maskless kids jam-packed into a high school hallway in Georgia, stoking alarm. 9 students and staff there testing positive. The school moving all classes online. Some parents emotionally debating what should come next.
What if worse comes to worse? Will board members commit to contributing to the GoFundMe campaign of a couple facing medical bills after their son or daughter contracts COVID-19?
Emblematic of the high-stakes conundrum in education, with some of the most vulnerable students, like those classified as English language learners or ELLs, facing dire effects. For Brooklyn 7th grader Jared Lee, school here in the U.S. in the best of times has been a challenge.
Science and art classes were difficult to teach because of my language barrier, so I ended up telling the teacher that my son will only take English and math classes.
But now his mom says the COVID-19 pandemic is posing unparalleled obstacles.
It makes it harder for my son to ask questions, especially when he has to take classes virtually with the rest of the classmates.
With virtual learning becoming a new norm for many schools nationwide, the switch to the screen is just one more barrier for children of non-native English speakers already facing an uphill battle.
When he learns math and doesn't understand, he is unable to ask questions. When I try to teach him, I teach him the way I was taught in Korea. Then my son would tell me that this isn't the way his teacher taught him.
And the problems magnified for students with special needs. Jared has autism, and his mom says the major adjustment has rattled her son.
Hangout delete 했잖아. 학교에서 어떠냐고. How do you feel? Sad? How sad? What did you do after Hangout is deleted? What did you do? Jumping and crying, whining for an hour. You don't remember?
And Jared's family is not alone. Concerns are mounting that the 10% of public school students in the U.S. who are identified as ELLs, about 5 million, are considered at risk of being disproportionately affected. No in-person interaction or validation, no in-person one-on-one mentoring, no peers to lean on for modeling and support.
At the end of the school year, we were asked to shut down. At least the teachers knew the parents, knew the children knew the teachers. Now, can you imagine our kindergartens, brand new, never been at school? The teacher that another adult that they don't know. So that is going to be a really big challenge for everyone, teachers, parents, and especially our students, and most now, our English learners.
It's a reality educators like Chicago principal Judy Sari say is widening existing gaps in education.
Do you feel that students who are in the ESL programs can get a comparable education while learning virtually?
Sadly, they were marginalized before. Now the gap is even larger. These children had not only the challenge of learning another language, coming to another culture, now it's even worse for them.
Even before COVID, at the national level, ELL students had a high school graduation rate of 67%, compared to 84% for their And the most recent data estimates that roughly 60% of ELLs come from low-income families.
We know that now with COVID, for example, it has disproportionately affected Latinos and more, in certain areas more than others, particularly in places like California. Knowing that also it's affecting, essential workers, which most of our parents are in. So what does that role at home mean when, mom or dad may not be home to support that learning?
Add to that a major shortfall in essential resources like like computers and internet, with ELL students less likely to have access to these vital tools.
We noticed a lot of the school closings were abrupt, right? And so that turned to a lot of online learning and what that looked like. And connectivity was the biggest issue as we saw that playing out, and also access to devices.
6-year-old kindergartner Tony Rodriguez doesn't have a computer at home, and he and his parents struggle with English language instruction.
Difficult because we don't speak a lot of English. We don't know English. And for him, he only knows Spanish. So when he starts school, it's difficult for him.
Through the pandemic, his family has turned to a local nonprofit so Tony wouldn't fall behind. Mentor Mary Beth Smith conducting lessons over the phone.
We've really practiced vocabulary, and then also just knowing numbers, just basic things that he'll need to know going into first grade.
They have helped him in language, in English, because he didn't know a lot of English, but now he knows a lot.
Tony's mom says the personal attention has made all the difference. And it's not just volunteers like Mary Beth going the extra mile. Sorry says many ELL teachers in her district are now working in overdrive, some even spending out of pocket to meet the needs of their classes.
I know teachers that are going out and buying whiteboards. That's out of their check. They want to be ready. This is a profession, and they know that the only way that they could be able to be the best, and teachers are really, really proud of who they are and their profession, and they're going out and they're spending all this money on instructional materials, on getting you ready to prepare these students, on even signing online courses.
But with the enormous burden, experts say, comes a new opportunity to brighten the future for these kids.
I really do hope that, our system completely rethinks this, this whole, how we serve our communities. About intentionally. And I think that's the biggest key in all of this, is really knowing your students. We have to know the students in front of us. And we've really, I think, we've got to bring this full circle to meeting, them as human beings and their families, and really trying to get them the best support that we can during this time.
And create new hope for families like Tony's and Jared's, that even in these uncertain times, they won't slip through the cracks. Ariel Reshef, ABC News.
So, to put a more optimistic spin on it, some examples of things that are being tried from the field. There actually is still very little research, unfortunately, on how to serve children who are English language learners. In early childhood, we talk about them as dual language learners because very young children are learning both their home language and the English language at the same time. But the typical term here is English language learners. There's very little research on how to serve them in distance or hybrid, part face-to-face, part distance settings for English language learners. There is very little that's known. So it's like building the airplane as you're flying it, so to speak, is my impression as I've done some reading. But there are some recommendations from the field. Let me just quickly say a little bit more, but these really I've gleaned from resources, most of which I put on the resource list for you, but they're kind of assembled together. I loved some of what I was reading from experienced master teachers about, as much as possible, this is where cognitive and social and emotional learning tie in so well together, but this is to promote learning and to increase the motivation of English language learners. Honestly, most of these I thought, well, that's good for all children, but these came specifically from teachers, principals, superintendents who are trying to work successfully with English language learners. As much as possible, a teacher talked about personalizing assignments that are given for virtual learning. For example, This person, I'll say he, I don't know who it was, talked about having the kids take selfies and either talking about or writing about something that they were doing at home, or some children are uncomfortable about images of their home, but this is like me, things about me. I just thought that emphasis on personalizing assignments as much as possible seemed, from the experience of this gentleman, to be very successful. Also, an emphasis in one of these resource materials on using as much as possible, let's say that it's via Zoom, breakout rooms, which is very feasible. I know both of my prof sons frequently use breakout rooms, but with, let's say, an elementary or middle school class, putting together pairs of students or small groups of students was creating like a little pod, and mixing English language learners, and this is addressing the issue that we've been talking about, both English language learners and children who are further along in their learning of English, or at any rate, encouraging opportunities to work together, virtually, and talk together in breakout rooms. And instructors, if you're not familiar with the breakout room concept, I'm not skilled enough to be doing it here, but can go from one breakout room to another and sort of see how the kids are doing and so on. A lot of what this one teacher did was the students in a breakout room would make up a story, for example, or they would plan a student presentation, and he was finding, or she was finding, that this kind of I'm doing a presentation was very motivating for the children to use their English. And also they did, this sounds like middle school to me, he did kind of awards, and then the students would have to make an acceptance speech like you would at the Oscars or the Grammys or something. They'd have to do a little acceptance speech. Other things that are broader, strong priorities in a number of districts with English language learners, I would say with everybody, family outreach, including professional development for teachers in how to do successful family outreach with families of children that they were serving as English language learners. There really are some nice examples, again, in these resources, of some state departments of education putting together resources specifically for teachers who virtually are trying to work successfully with their English language learners. Online modular professional development from some large school districts. And some of these resources, they're available to anybody, so they can be downloaded, adapted, and so on, or just a sort of source of ideas. One idea that I wouldn't have thought of, and I thought was really interesting, was finding people within the community who, maybe these are people who are retired or who are out of the workforce for whatever reason, to help support neighbors, for example, to help support remote learning by children who are English language learners. And these might be people who are really bilingual, who have roots in the community, but know English as well, and trying to engage them in different ways in supporting the learning from home of these children. Also, a really cool idea of pairing up tech buddies. So classmates who may or may not also be English language learners, but since technology for many families is very challenging, even if they have an iPad or something, just for parents who may not have technology skills. So finding a classmate who virtually, through a phone call, can help out, helps everybody, and also strengthens the relationships and the social and emotional learning that are so important. Also a reminder that if possible, instead of sort of segregating, so to speak, the English language learners into their own group for improving their English, doing more mixed group instruction for the reasons that some of you were talking about, that without having that sort of social language, that rich language environment of just hearing people, even if you're missing 60% of it, just hearing your classmates speaking English. Another teacher created what she called phone pals, maybe with volunteers, a fellow student who would once a week, it would be an assignment to call up another student on the phone and, you know, how's it going, and answering questions. And these aren't the top students, but to be sharing, to be as much as possible using both their home language and the English language that they're learning. Also, emphasis on let's not prioritize learning English to such an extent that the rich, relevant, authentic content is lost. Let's have kids learning English through realistic, engaging math assignments or science projects and so on. And a final thing before we move on is a reminder that because so many families of English language learners do not have internet access or minimal internet access, and as adults may not be at all comfortable using that or have very limited experience using it, to think about sending home print materials, not just internet-based materials for families, so that even if the internet materials are, let's say, for instance, in Spanish, if internet access is a real barrier for the adults in the family, the parents, the grandparents, then, you know, just get out the mimeograph machine, so to speak. So that's kind of a brain dump on support for English language learners. Before we go on to talk more generally about reopening schools and so on, are there reactions or additional examples that somebody would like to share? Claudia, I see a blue hand. Is that's you?
Marilou, I think Claudia has her hand up, and I also do. Claudia, you go first.
No, that was, I guess I thought you took it down. That was from before. I'm always talking. Let somebody else
Okay.
Thank you.
So am I.
Please be our guest.
I have two grandchildren in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the Montgomery school system. And they had an option starting at preschool, whether they wanted to go into a total immersion program. And they opted to. So from the time they were in preschool, they went into total immersion Spanish. Okay. And this is not half Spanish, half English. This is not, there's an English teacher, there's a Spanish teacher. This means from the time they were in preschool, every single thing that was taught in school was Spanish. This went all the way through 8th grade, okay? My older grandson is now in high school, and still a couple of his classes are in Spanish. My granddaughter's in middle school, and most of her classes are still in Spanish. So I think what our country really doesn't focus on enough is total immersion programs. And speaking personally, my husband and I were in the Peace Corps in the 60s.
Oh, yay.
Both of us were afraid we wouldn't get accepted because we were horrible in foreign languages. And you had to pass a foreign language class in order to be accepted. And we were going to Brazil, so it was Portuguese. In our training program, which was 14 weeks, we were in total immersion Portuguese, 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, okay? Our professors were Brazilians. They only spoke Portuguese to us. We didn't even have a printed thing in front of us until 5 weeks later, okay? And it was the way infants learn a language. Listen, repeat, listen, repeat, listen, repeat. We came out of there with a conversational basis in Portuguese, okay? My 2 grandkids speak Spanish. My older daughter went to Guatemala for 3 months in a total immersion Spanish course and came out speaking Spanish. So I think we lose sight of that. I think with our kids in schools now, there are ways that TV programs, you talk to some young people that speak from foreign countries that speak beautiful English, and you ask them, where'd you learn your English? In school? They said, not really. I sat in front of the television and listened to English programs 10 hours a day, okay?
Yeah.
Again, that's total immersion. I think with our school kids now, someone could develop some kind of creative TV shows. I mean, we used to have Sesame Street, Electric Company, that would be this total immersion. I also think that instead of worrying as much about the internet, provide families with a little portable CD, DVD player with books on discs, send that home with the book in print to kids and have them press a button, listen to the CD, the CD or DVD, and flip through the book. So I think sometimes we're looking at some of the most sophisticated ways of trying to do this when we lose sight of how we ourselves really learn a second language.
Thank you. Two quick thoughts. One is that I think your comments illustrate something even more general, that the pandemic and the challenges in education that it has uncovered, right? Like the tremendous gaps and difficulties that children and families who do not speak English, teachers who are English speakers and trying to support English language learners, all of this, which existed before, has been uncovered. And I think in that area and in so many other areas, in some ways, COVID-19 is, as I said before, shining a spotlight on some of these challenges and these disparities, and really may help us think in some innovative ways going forward. So thank you for that. I think, Karen, was there someone else who wanted to share before we go on, or are we good?
I don't see any more hands.
Okay.
Claudia's is still up, but she said that was from before. So.
Okay. She's disowning the hand. Okay. Let me go on then. Thank you. So, looking to the future, again, all of these pieces tie together. I hope it's semi-coherent. So looking forward, I had titled this earlier, Reopening Schools. And then the more I read and the more I thought about it, it's not a dichotomy. You know what I mean? It's not like schools are open or schools are closed, or learning is virtual, learning is like, there's so much complexity, even right now, in the mixes in different places, and even from this week to next week to the week after, in the configurations that schools have. So just saying that as an explanation for why I'm not calling it reopening schools, that seems simplistic. But we do know, and I wish that Carol, who had to go to a unexpectedly, were here, because Carol was talking in a very deeply felt way about the fact that for some children that she's worked with professionally, having a break from face-to-face school with bullying or rejection may not be such a bad thing. But to generalize, the preponderance of evidence and professional belief is it's better for kids to be live with a teacher and classmates than not. That there is real agreement on that for most children in this age group, are 5 to 12 and younger, in the best of worlds, in the best world, in-person instruction is best. But this is not the best of all worlds now. One of the questions, of course, but partly as a practical matter, is if there's going to be a transition to in-person teaching, who should have priority? Who should be accommodated? And I am sure you all have thoughts about that. I'm peeking at the time. Maybe at the end you can share some, but some of the things you may be thinking about, people have talked, there is no easy answer, right? And different districts and different places and different kinds of communities have thought about different things. Children with disabilities, many people have said that children with many kinds of diagnosed disabilities, it is extremely difficult, as we touched on a few weeks ago, to provide certain kinds of services for children if they are home, young children, if they are home, don't have access to the kind of specialized services that they need, alternatives for those services. Maybe that's not a problem everywhere, but in many, many cases, it is. I'm thinking as an example, and the situation is sorted out, but I have a great niece who has Down syndrome, lives in Tennessee, and her program was closed completely. And they found a childcare program that the parents were working, could accommodate her. They thought the childcare program kicked her out. A private childcare program. They said they couldn't handle with the staff that they had. She has some behavioral issues. And fortunately, the family was able to afford to hire kind of a paraprofessional to help implement some aspects of her IEP. And again, it's been sorted out better now, but those kinds of things are really challenging for families of children who have many kinds of disabilities. So that's one thing. Some people have said English language learners, for all of the reasons that we've been looking at, should be sort of a prior as we transition to more frequent, more intensive in-person teaching and learning. But I was reading an article that quoted, a newspaper article from the Times maybe, that quoted a parent as saying, don't prioritize those kids who don't know English. My kids were born here and they deserve in-person learning just as much. And, one can argue against that, but parents are passionate about their own children. And it's like, don't give those vaccines to those people. We deserve them more. So the other thing to keep in mind is that not all parents are equally eager for their children to go back to in-person classrooms. And I found an article in The Economist in January, just last month, that found, and this was US parents, when asked whether they wanted their children to return to in-person teaching, 68% of white parents said they wanted their kids to go back. 36% of Black parents and 50% of Latino parents. Why those disparities? Again, you may think about a number of reasons. Speculatively, I think there's a combination. One is that in many communities that predominantly serve families of minority groups, African American, Latino, the quality of the existing schools may not be that great. The quality of the teachers and the teaching, I'm broad brushing, right? May not be that great. There also, especially among African American parents, is a keen awareness of the history of racism in the provision of health services. They may feel that their school is not as safe, that the risks of infection are are higher, or that the services that they and their families may need will not be provided. Just general distrust of health services, the poor physical condition of schools in many minority communities. I was reading something about reopening, and ventilation, as I'm sure you know, is a big issue. And there are schools in places like Chester, Pennsylvania, where you can hardly even open the windows. The windows are painted shut, and all of these things that one sort of takes for granted in the kind of schools like, Karen, your grandchildren attend, and our children attended when they were high school, elementary and high school students, are not in place. So there are a lot of options and a lot of issues that people are thinking about. And, as I said before, I just put these photos up there to illustrate that, when we think about reopening schools, or, what's school going to look like, there are so many different possible configurations, and it's not going to look the same. Everything from a child still studying remotely, sitting in her backyard at a little desk, to kids with plexiglass around them, children sitting on their designated 6 feet on a rug, children physically at school, but their teachers are teaching from home, all kinds of combinations for lots of reasons. And this is, again, sort of a fast trot just in the interest of time. But the reality, according to a bunch of experts, is that the likelihood, it's not a reality, but the high likelihood is that by next fall, most children probably will return to school full time. That's, if you had to bet, but there's always the buts. And it may not be really full time, or there may be a need in some communities there may be a need for different looking school formats going forward. So what people in the schools are saying is that it's sort of, they have to plan, but they have to plan for a lot of different scenarios. And they have to take into account, as now with these new variants of COVID-19, that things could change on a dime. I think one of the lessons that has been learned from almost a year ago, the beginning of the pandemic, there was no advance warning. It was on a dime. Schools had to close, teachers, principals had to quickly figure out how to provide something, and struggle. Everyone was struggling. And I think one of the lessons that has been learned is that we can't let that happen again. We can't just have one narrow idea of how all of this is going to play out. So it's kind of a both and, right? And all of that means that virtual learning, distance learning, is probably going to continue to be present during the transition and beyond. And you know what? I think from what I and many of you have already read or know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that a lot is being learned and has been learned about how to use virtual learning, whether children are physically in the classroom or not, in ways that are developmentally appropriate, that are engaging. There's so many resources have been and are continuing to be developed by educators, psychologists, others, that will be available. And I think people may be seeing the potential for certain uses of virtual learning. And again, not seeing this as an either or, but what can be more effectively for some children, maybe presented virtually wherever they are physically, and what not. Another really important point of, I would say, consensus is that the research and the professional recommendations really prioritize as children transition back to in-person learning, building relationships, not, I think I might have said this last week, not saying, oh my goodness, these kids are so far behind in their reading or their math. And so we're, it's sort of like people did right back in the 60s and the 70s, with preschool children in low-income communities, and saying, well, we've got to get them ready for school, which means we've got to do nothing but drill them on the ABCs, on addition, and so on, prioritizing relationships with peers, relationships with teachers, emotional security, social and emotional learning. I came across something, again, I think it's in the resources from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and in the plans that are being worked on with districts, I assume, there intentionally is an emphasis on planning for social and emotional learning. In other words, not just saying, oh, well, yes, that's really important, but what are your plans for linking with children in ways that build their confidence, their security, that build or rebuild these social relationships, or, for little kindergartners who may never have seen the inside of a school or a preschool, where are you going to start? An interesting thing, and this was only I came across in one thing, some of you who are educators know the concept of looping, which has been used sometimes in public schools, sometimes private schools. The idea is that the same teacher stays with the class of kids for 2 years or sometimes 3 years, right? I think maybe Waldorf schools do that. Anyway, that this may be a promising thing to think about in building, again, emotional security, strengthening relationships, individualizing learning more. So that same teacher, it's one, it's what is the goal and what are the methods? This is more like a method. If one of the goals is to really develop relationships, not only with classmates, but with teachers, there may be a lot of potential in something like teacher looping. Also, I've seen several calls for, or reminders, I guess I would say, for a focus in the academic learning that takes place. And, we're really talking here about K6 to K8 or so, to go for depth rather than breadth. There's so much concern, again, going back to learning loss, and well, we have to make it up. We have to make it up, and the pull can be toward, well, let's look at the 500 standards that we're supposed to cover, and let's have like 5 standards a day, and we're going to get it all done, right? And instead of, and I've also seen on videos and elsewhere, teacher leaders, school leaders saying, we really need to encourage, identify what are the most critical standards that will get us and the children the most bang for the buck, and what are the methods that we can use to help children make progress in relation to those power standards, as they're sometimes called, that will be culturally relevant, personally interesting, engaging, that will get children collaborating, working with each other, not just, Lillian Katz, whose work in early childhood, I think a number of you know, used to say at conferences and so on, in her British voice, that our goal should not be to cover the curriculum, but to uncover it. And I always loved that. Just take it apart and see what the juicy bits are in there. So just a couple of other things that I've come across that I thought were worth summarizing and sharing. Yes, indeed, there are learning gaps or, learning that needs to either be made up or enriched. There are real issues, especially for children in low-income communities, children who are English language learners, children who otherwise have learning vulnerabilities. So there's a lot of talk about summer programs, but a lot of interesting talk about let's not make it like the summer school where the kids flunked math and science, and what we're going to do is just go over the whole textbook again all summer, but really using it makes me think about the early days of Head Start, which was a summer program before it became full day, full year. So how to best use, if possible, summer programs, not to just do a race to catch up, but to really, again, give depth, meaning, build social and emotional skills, and so on. A lot of emphasis on teacher professional development, to which teachers are very motivated to get about how they can help narrow these disparities, and without getting children to feel discouraged about themselves as smart, capable young learners. People are talking about tutoring. And, different way of thinking about tutoring, but there's some stuff coming out of the Brookings Institution about so-called high dosage tutoring, really targeting, not in a mean, you stupid kid, we're going to help you make this up, but individual one-on-one or very small group may really help jumpstart things. Remote learning, as I say, it's not going away. Next week, we'll listen to teachers' voices. I found, because this really ties in with supporting adults, their NPR has it's kind of an audio clip, a really interesting interview with 3 public school teachers about reopening. And it's very heartfelt. It's kind of hard to listen to in the passion that they have and the realistic concerns that they have about whether they are understood and respected going forward. So let me wrap this up by reminding us that next week is the last session in this OLLI class, and the designated topic is supporting adults during COVID-19 and beyond. And the thought was certainly to think about teachers and what they, not so much what they need to do for children, as important as that is, but what is it that they need to be supported, but also, and very importantly, families. What do and will families need as they continue, and we know it will continue, at least in the coming months and probably years, as they continue to struggle with not only how to support their children, but how to manage their own anxieties and frustrations and concerns about their work, their family, the older generation, and so on. So that's sort of the core plan for next week. I will show a little more of the UNICEF materials, but I also want to ask you, maybe not right now, the snow is falling hard and the afternoon is charging on, but if there are other topics either that we've touched on in the previous classes and you would like to have more opportunity either to learn a bit more about or simply to talk about, or if there's something that you had sort of hoped we would have an opportunity to talk about and somehow it hasn't yet come up, could you just maybe shoot me an email and let me know what that might be? And I can hustle around and see what I can pull together, I would be more than happy to do that. By the way, I had said I was hoping that my friend and former colleague Linda Espinosa could help us with English language learners, but she was leaving. She didn't say this, but I think they were going skiing for 2 weeks, and she was not going to be back. I'm leaving in the morning, unfortunately. I think she thought this was like a whole semester class or something, and she's not getting back until I think the day after our last class. But anyway, her resources are always terrific, and it was nice to be able to touch base with her again. So that is it for today. And thank you all so much for your contributions and your interest, and enjoy the snow, and see you next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.